Clara used her last spool of waxed thread to mend the shredded cloak of a dying beggar. She had no bread, no firewood, and no hope of surviving the bitter winter. Yet, she asked for nothing when the massive stranger collapsed inside her freezing shop. She did not know his hands were stained with the blood of a rebellion. She did not know he was being hunted by 1,000 crimson soldiers. And when she found the heavy iron signet ring he left on her empty table, her breath caught in her throat. The man she just saved from the frost was not a peasant. He was Raymond, the ruthless and legendary sovereign of the northern realms. The winter wind screamed through the narrow streets of Oakhaven, carrying the chill of the mountains. Inside a cramped workshop, Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. A single candle flickered on her table, casting dancing shadows across bolts of cheap fabric. Her fingers ached from hours of piercing thick cloth with her iron needle. Bread presses had doubled since the king's collectors arrived last moon, leaving her pantry bare. Yet Clara refused to complain, knowing many families in the village fared much worse in this frost. A sudden thud rattled her front door, startling her from her quiet thoughts. She froze, clutching a half-finished vest to her chest as the wind roared outside. Silence followed, heavy and tense against the storm that battered the shutters. Setting her needle down, Clara walked slowly toward the entrance, her boots clicking softly on the stone floor. She pulled the wooden bolt back, squinting into the darkness of the night. A large figure collapsed forward, his heavy frame slamming onto the floorboards of her shop. Clara gasped, immediately dropping to her knees beside the unconscious stranger. Snow covered his shoulders, melting into a ragged cloak that smelled of smoke and earth. His leather boots were worn through to the skin, encrusted with mud from long miles of travel. With great effort, Clara dragged the man inside and heaved the door shut against the frost. The stranger groaned, stirring slightly as the warmth of the hearth touched his pale face. Dark hair clung to his forehead, framing a scarred jawline that spoke of a harsh life. Despite his ragged appearance, an air of authority clung to his silent form. Clara fetched a wooden cup of warm water, kneeling by his side once more. "Drink this, sir," she whispered, gently lifting his head to help him sip. Raymond opened his eyes, his gaze piercing despite his exhaustion. For a heartbeat he looked ready to strike, his muscles tensing like a coiled spring. Then, seeing her gentle eyes, the defensive tension drained from his shoulders. He took the cup, his calloused hand brushing against her slender fingers. The warmth of the water seemed to revive him, though he remained silent, studying her humble surroundings. Clara noticed the terrible state of his wool cloak, which was torn open from collar to hem. "That garment will not keep out the wind," she said, pointing to the ruined fabric. Raymond glanced down at the shredded wool, a bitter smile touching his lips. "It is all I have left to my name," he muttered, his voice raspy. Clara stood up and walked to her sewing basket, searching for her strongest thread. She found a spool of waxed twine, the last of her premium supplies reserved for paying customers. Without hesitation, she brought a spool closer to the hearth where he sat. "Take it off, and I will mend it for you," she offered softly, holding out her hands. Raymond hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly in disbelief at her unearned kindness. "I have no coin to pay you, woman," he warned, his tone flat and unyielding. Clara smiled gently, shaking her head as she took the cloak from his hands. "The storm outside pays no heed to coin, and neither do I tonight," she replied simply. She sat near the fire, her needle moving with swift grace through the heavy wool. Raymond watched her silently, his gaze never leaving her focused face. He was unaccustomed to such kindness, especially from a peasant who clearly had so little to give. For months, his lords had plotted his downfall, forcing him into this exile to gather his loyal forces. They called him a tyrant, yet this stranger treated him like a human being in need. Clara focused on her work, ignoring the powerful energy that filled her room. She pulled those stitches tight, ensuring the seams would hold against the mountain gales. The silence between them grew comfortable, broken only by the crackle of burning logs. As midnight approached, Clara tied the final knot and cut the thread with her shears. She shook out the cloak, the deep tears now sealed by neat stitches. "It is not beautiful, but it will keep you warm," she said, handing it back to him. Raymond took the garment, feeling the unexpected strength of her repairs between his fingers. He wrapped it around his shoulders, immediately feeling the barrier against the cold. Looking at her tired eyes, a profound sense of gratitude washed over his hardened heart. "You have a generous soul, Clara," he said, reading the wooden sign above her workbench. She flushed slightly, unaccustomed to such praise from a traveler. "We must help each other survive the winter," she answered simply, cleaning her tools. Raymond stood up, his towering figure filling the space of her humble shop. He knew he had to leave before his pursuers tracked him to this quiet refuge. "I will not forget this kindness," he promised, his voice carrying a weight that startled her. Clara watched him open the door, the winter storm swallowing his frame almost instantly. She locked the bolt, wondering if she would ever see the beggar again. Turning back to her table, her eyes caught a dull glint reflecting in the candlelight. Rested upon her empty bread box sat an iron signet ring, engraved with a roaring wolf. Clara picked it up, her breath catching as she realized the true identity of her guest. He was not a beggar at all, but Raymond, the legendary sovereign of the northern realms. The howling wind battered the wooden walls as if angry at being kept outside. Clara stared at the heavy ring in her palm, feeling the cold metal press against her skin. Legends spoke of King Raymond as a ruthless warlord who conquered with an iron fist. Rumors claimed he had vanished during a bloody coup orchestrated by his own brother. Now, the most feared man in the kingdom had just sat by her humble fire. She traced the intricate carvings of the wolf, a symbol of royal authority. Panic briefly flared in her chest, wondering if she had offended him by offering charity. Yet she remembered the surprising gentleness in his eyes when he thanked her. He had looked at her not as a ruler examining a subject, but as a man seeing a savior. Clara carefully wrapped the signet ring in a scrap of linen cloth. She hid the precious object beneath a loose floorboard near her spinning wheel. Sleep eluded her for the rest of the night, her mind racing with dangerous possibilities. Dawn broke over Oakhaven, casting a pale gray light across the snow-covered rooftops. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the wind. Villagers emerged from their homes, shivering as they shoveled the deep drifts blocking their doors. Clara wrapped her repaired shawl around her head and stepped out into the freezing morning. She needed firewood, hoping to gather fallen branches from the edge of the woods. The snow crunched loudly beneath her worn boots with every step she took. At the edge of the village, a group of armed soldiers on horseback blocked the main road. They wore crimson cloaks, the crest of the usurper brothers shining on their breastplates. Clara ducked behind a wooden wagon, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. The lead rider shouted demands, his voice harsh and commanding. They were searching for a fugitive, describing a tall man with a scarred jaw. Anyone caught hiding him would face immediate execution, the soldier warned. Clara pressed her back against the wagon, closing her eyes tight. She had knowingly aided the kingdom's most wanted man just hours ago. If they searched her shop and found his ring, she would hang before sunset. Waiting until the riders moved toward the tavern, she hurried back to her shop. Her hands shook as she bolted the door, locking herself inside the dim room. She knew her quiet, invisible life in Oakhaven had ended the moment the beggar arrived. Fate had tied her to King Raymond, and she could only pray he survived the winter. Heavy boots marched in unison across the frozen mud of Oakhaven. Soldiers tore through the village, kicking open doors and dragging frightened residents into the street. Clara sat rigid behind her sewing table, listening to the muffled screams echoing from the tavern. Her hands shook as she picked at a dull needle, pretending to focus on a linen shirt. The heavy iron signet ring remained buried beneath the floorboards, cold and hidden in the dark. A sudden crash splintered the quiet of her shop as the wooden door flew inward. 3 soldiers stepped over the threshold, bringing the bitter wind and the smell of wet iron with them. The captain walked forward, his crimson cloak brushing against her cheap fabric bolts. He drew a long dagger, using the blade to lazily flick over a basket of wool scraps. "Have you seen a tall man with a scarred face, Seamstress?" he demanded, his voice thick with authority. Clara kept her eyes lowered to her work, praying her trembling hands would not now betray her. "Many travelers pass through Oakhaven before the deep snows arrive," she answered evenly. The captain stepped closer, the muddy toe of his boot resting heavily on the loose floorboard. Beneath that exact piece of wood lay the symbol of the sovereign he sought to murder. Clara held her breath, expecting him to notice the slight unevenness of the timber. Instead, he turned his attention to the bolts of dark wool stacked on her modest shelf. "These will make fine blankets for the king's men," the captain declared, gesturing to his soldiers. Without waiting for a response, the men swept the fabric into their arms. Clara stood up quickly, a rare flash of desperation breaking her calm demeanor. "Please, that is my entire livelihood for the winter season," she pleaded, stepping forward. The captain laughed harshly, shoving her back toward the table with the flat of his hand. "Consider it a noble tax to the crown, peasant," he sneered, turning his back on her. They marched out of the shop, leaving the shattered door hanging precariously on its hinges. Clara collapsed onto her wooden stool, burying her face in her empty, calloused hands. The wind howled through the broken entrance, stealing the last remnants of warmth from the hearth. She had protected Raymond, but the cost of her silence was everything she owned. For the next 3 weeks, starvation slowly tightened its grip on the remote village. Clara survived on thin broth made from dried roots and stale crusts of bread. She burned her broken furniture to keep the small fire alive against the relentless frost. Every night, when the silence became unbearable, she pulled the heavy ring from its hiding place. Tracing the engraved wolf provided a strange comfort in the dark, freezing room. She wondered if the stranger had survived the mountain pass, or if the soldiers had caught him. High above the valley, surrounded by jagged peaks, Raymond did not freeze. He stood at the edge of a deep ravine, watching a line of armored men approach through the snow. The secret fortress of Blackreach loomed behind him, carved directly into the dark granite of the mountain. General Vance stepped forward from the ranks, falling to one knee in the deep snow. "My liege, we thought you perished in the capital," the old warrior said, his voice thick with emotion. Raymond placed a hand on his loyal commander's shoulder, urging him to rise. "My brother struck deep, but he did not sever the head of the wolf," Raymond replied coldly. He turned toward the gathered army, their breath pluming in the freezing air. These were the elite forces of the northern realms, men who refused to bow to a usurper. They looked at their sovereign, expecting to see him wrapped in royal furs or heavy armor. Instead, Raymond wore a simple lighted cloak, heavily stitched with thick, waxed twine. Vance eyed the crude repairs, frowning at the humble garment. "We have fresh cloaks within the armory, sire," the general offered, gesturing toward the gates. Raymond pulled the mended wool tighter around his broad chest. "No," he answered, his piercing gaze sweeping over the valley below. "This cloak reminds me of a debt I owe, and a mercy my brother will never understand." Inside the war room, torches cast flickering light across a massive wooden map of the kingdom. Raymond moved carved wooden pieces across the board, plotting his ruthless retribution. Yet, in the quiet moments between strategy, his thoughts drifted back to the small shop in Oakhaven. He remembered the tired lines around Clara's eyes as she threaded her needle. He remembered her unhesitating offer to mend his clothes, asking nothing in return. In a world built on blood and betrayal, her pure kindness felt like a forgotten magic. Raymond knew his usurper brother would tax the outer villages into starvation to fund the coming war. He struck the wooden table with a heavy fist, startling his commanders. "We march before the thaw," Raymond announced, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "We will secure the northern border villages first, starting with Oakhaven." General Vance nodded, though confusion flickered in his sharp eyes. "Oakhaven holds no strategic value, sire," Vance cautioned, tracing the route on the map. Raymond met his general's gaze, his expression hardening into immovable stone. "It holds something far more valuable than gold or stone," the king stated. He touched the thick stitches on his chest, a silent vow binding him to the woman in the valley. He would reclaim his throne, but first, he would shield her from the storm he had brought to her door. Down in the village, the reality of winter grew harsher with every passing day. Clara wrapped her remaining scraps of linen around her boots to keep the frostbite at bay. Her hands, once nimble and steady, now shook constantly from the biting cold. The villagers rarely left their homes, hoarding whatever meager supplies the soldiers had left behind. She tried to find work mending clothes for her neighbors, but no one had copper to spare. The heavy iron ring beneath the floorboards felt heavier in her mind as hunger gnawed at her stomach. Sometimes, so wondered if she should try to sell it to a passing merchant for a loaf of bread. But she knew the distinct royal crest would bring immediate execution, not salvation. One evening, Clara collapsed beside her dying fire, too weak to fetch more wood. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, mirroring the despair pooling in her chest. She thought of the tall stranger, his dark eyes holding a lifetime of unspoken battles. He had called her generous, a word that now felt like a cruel mockery of her current destitution. Yet, a strange, stubborn pride kept her from regretting her actions. Back in the high mountains, the preparations for war moved with relentless efficiency. Steel rang in the courtyards of Blackreach as soldiers sharpened their blades against grinding stones. Raymond stood on the high battlements, watching the snow fall over his gathering army. He ordered his Scots to monitor the roads leading into Oakhaven. Reports came back of the Crimson Cloak stripping the village of its grain and livestock. Anger coiled tight in his chest, a cold fury that promised devastating violence. He would tear down the crimson banners and burn the traitors where they stood. But when the slaughter ended, he knew exactly whose door he would knock on first. Raymond turned away from the battlements, his mended cloak billowing in the mountain wind. The wolf was ready to descend, and the snow would soon turn red with retribution. The hearth in Claire's workshop finally died, leaving only gray ash and biting frost. Ice crept up the stone walls, painting the small room in a pale, deathly sheen. She huddled in the corner, wrapping her thin arms around her shivering knees. Hunger had carved hollows into her cheeks, making her eyes look unnaturally large in the gloom. The heavy iron ring pressed into her palm, the metal absorbing the last of her body heat. Outside, shouts shattered the grim silence of the freezing evening. The usurper's soldiers had returned to Oakhaven, demanding the last hidden winter rations. Torches flared in the street, casting violent orange light through the cracks in her broken door. Heavy fists hammered against the wood of her neighbor's house, followed by the sound of splintering timber. Clarice clasped her eyes shut, praying the armed men would pass by her empty shop. Instead, boots crunched heavily on the snow right outside her entrance. "Check the seamstress again," a familiar, harsh voice ordered. It was the same captain who had stolen her wool, his tone laced with malice. "She might have hoarded grain beneath the floorboards," he added. Panic seized Clara's chest as she realized they would tear up the wood and find the royal crest. She tried to stand, but her numb legs refused to support her weight. Before he could take another step toward her, a deep, resonant sound echoed through the valley. It was a war horn, blowing a single, terrifying note that vibrated deep in the chest. The ground beneath Oakhaven began to tremble, a low rumble that grew rapidly into a deafening roar. Thousands of armored war horses crested the snowy ridge, their dark silhouettes blocking out the moonlight. At the head of the charge rode Raymond, seated atop a massive warhorse black as midnight. The northern army swept down into the valley like an unstoppable avalanche of iron and fury. Raymond's cavalry hit the Crimson soldiers, shattering their ranks in a single devastating impact. Swords flashed in the darkness, moving with the lethal precision of a practiced execution. The king fought with terrifying efficiency, his blade a blur of fatal strikes. Enemies fell before him like wheat before a scythe, their resistance crumbling into dust. There was no chaotic butchery, only the cold, systematic eradication of traitors. The captain in Clara's shop rushed outside, raising his weapon with a desperate cry. Raymond spotted the Crimson Cloak and spurred his horse forward, closing the distance in seconds. The brutal impact sent the captain flying backward into the snow, his weapon shattered. Silence fell over Oakhaven almost as quickly as the violence had begun. Raymond halted his horse in the center of the square, his chest heaving under his mended wool cloak. His dark eyes scanned the ruined storefronts until they locked onto a broken doorway. Raymond dismounted, his heavy boots hitting the snow with a definitive thud. He handed the reins to General Vance and walked slowly toward the dark shop. The villagers peeked through their shattered windows, watching the feared conqueror stride through their streets. He moved with a predatory grace, an aura of absolute dominance radiating from his tall frame. Yet, when he reached the threshold of the seamstress's home, he stopped. He stepped into the freezing room, the darkness clinging to the stone walls. In the far corner, Clara lay curled on the floor, her breath forming faint white clouds. Her eyes were half closed, the bitter cold dragging her toward an endless sleep. Raymond dropped his sword, the heavy steel clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. The sound startled Clara, forcing her to open her eyes and focus on the towering silhouette. He fell to his knees beside her, uncaring of the dirt and snow ruining his leather armor. The fearsome sovereign reached out with calloused hands, gently pulling her fragile body into his arms. Clara felt the rough wool of his cloak, the exact fabric she had stitched weeks ago. "You came back," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Raymond removed his heavy winter mantle, wrapping the thick fur tightly around her freezing shoulders. "I told you I would not forget, Clara," he answered, his deep voice thick with an unfamiliar emotion. He lifted her effortlessly against his broad chest, holding her as if she weighed nothing. The contrast was striking. The most dangerous man in the kingdom cradling a broken peasant. Clara leaned her head against his armor, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. For the first time in months, she felt a profound sense of safety. Raymond carried her out into the street, stepping into the harsh light of the torches. His soldiers stood at attention, their expressions hardened by bore. They watched their ruthless king carry a starving woman with a tenderness none had ever witnessed. General Vance stepped forward, bowing his head respectfully as Raymond approached. "Secure the village and distribute our rations to the people," Raymond commanded loudly. The king looked down at Clara, seeing the heavy iron ring clutched tightly in her pale hand. She had kept his secret, starving herself rather than surrendering his crest to the enemy. A fierce protective fire ignited in his chest, burning away the last remnants of winter's chill. He looked back up at his general, his jaw set with immovable resolve. "Burn the crimson banners," Raymond ordered, his voice echoing across the silent valley. "This village is under my absolute protection, and those who brought harm to it will face my full retribution." Wagons loaded with grain and salted meat rolled into the town square. The starving villagers crept out of their homes, their eyes wide with disbelief and cautious hope. Raymond ignored the commotion, his entire focus anchored on the frail woman in his arms. He carried Clara toward the village tavern, the largest building with a functional stone hearth. His guards immediately cleared the room, throwing extra logs onto the dying fire. Raymond set her gently on a wooden bench near the flames, keeping the heavy furs wrapped around her. He knelt on the hearthstone, stoking the fire until a warm, golden glow filled the room. Clara watched him, struggling to reconcile the gentle man before her with the legendary conqueror. He possessed the power to crush kingdoms, yet he meticulously adjusted a blanket over her freezing feet. A soldier brought a bowl of hot stew, the rich scent of meat and root vegetables filling the air. He held the spoon himself, waiting patiently for the broth to cool. "You must eat slowly," he instructed, his tone surprisingly soft. Clara took a small sip, the warmth spreading rapidly through her hollow stomach. Tears pricked her eyes, an overwhelming wave of relief cracking over her exhausted mind. She tried to hold the bowl, but her hands still trembled uncontrollably. Raymond did not pull away. He simply supported her wrists with his large, steady hands. "They took your livelihood because of me," he stated, his gaze fixed on her thin face. "They took it because they are cruel men," she replied, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "I chose to help you, and I do not regret my choice." Raymond stared at her, deeply moved by the quiet resilience in her weary eyes. Here, a destitute seamstress had risked execution for a stranger with nothing to offer. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a streak of soot from her pale cheek. "Your debt is paid in fey, Clara," he promised, the vow absolute. "From this night forward, you will never know hunger or cold again." Outside, the wind continued to howl, but the storm could no longer reach her. The fire burned steadily through the long, freezing winter night. Raymond remained in a heavy wooden chair beside the hearth, refusing to close his eyes. He watched Clara rest, her breathing finally becoming deep and even. General Vance entered the tavern just before dawn, shaking heavy snow from his boots. "The village is secured, sire," the veteran soldier reported quietly. Raymond kept his gaze fixed on the dying embers. "What of the usurper's men?" he asked, his voice deliberately low. "They will not trouble this valley again," Vance answered simply. The king nodded, rising slowly to prevent his armor from clattering. Clara stirred at the slight noise, pulling the thick fur blanket tighter around her neck. She opened her eyes, finding Raymond standing over her. "We march for Blackreach within the hour," he informed her. Confusion and fear briefly widened her dark eyes. "I cannot ride, for I have no horse," she said, struggling to sit up. "You will ride with me," Raymond replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He gestured toward a heavy wooden trunk his guards had carried inside earlier. Inside lay winter garments of fine wool lined with gray fox fur. "Dress warmly, Clara," he instructed, before stepping out into the freezing morning. She touched the rich fabric, marveling at the incredible softness. These clothes were meant for high-born ladies, not a simple seamstress. Yet, the bitter draft in the room reminded her of her grim reality. Clara quickly changed into the warm layers, her stiff joints aching with every movement. When she emerged into the village square, the scale of the Northern Army stole her breath. Thousands of soldiers stood in perfect formation, their breath pluming in the icy air. Raymond waited beside his massive warhorse, holding the reins with one gloved hand. Beneath the mended cloak, his dark steel armor marked him as a ruthless warlord. Seeing her approach, he stepped forward and offered his hand. Clara placed her small, scarred fingers into his large palm. Before she could find her footing on the stirrup, he lifted her effortlessly by the waist. He settled her sideways on the saddle, sitting closely behind her a moment later. "Hold on to my arm," Raymond ordered, urging the great horse forward. The march into the mountains began, creating a steady rhythm of iron hooves against packed snow. Clara leaned back against his solid chest, shielded completely from the biting wind. The journey took hours, winding through treacherous passes and towering pine forests. Silence hung heavily between them, broken only by the sounds of the marching army. Despite the intimidating presence of the soldiers, Clara felt a strange peace. She watched the rugged landscape pass by, realizing she had never left the borders of Oakhaven before today. By midday, the jagged peaks parted to reveal the fortress of Blackreach. It was a massive structure carved directly into the dark granite of the mountain face. High stone walls surrounded a sprawling courtyard, bristling with iron spikes and armed guards. Raymond rode through the heavy iron gates without slowing his mount. Soldiers and servants knelt in the snow as their sovereign passed. Clara gripped his arm tighter, acutely aware of her humble origins. The stark reality of her peasant life clashed violently with this world of immense power. Raymond brought the horse to a halt near the main keep. Stepping down first, he reached up to help her dismount. His hands lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second before he stepped back. "Welcome to Blackreach," he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. A group of high-ranking commanders hurried down the stone steps to greet him. They wore rich furs and polished steel armor, their eyes darting curiously toward the ragged woman. One lord, an older man with a sharp gaze, stepped ahead of the others. "Sire, we did not expect you to return with a captive," the lord remarked smoothly. Raymond turned his head, his expression instantly hardening into stone. "She is not a captive, Lord Thorn," he corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. The king stepped closer to the older man, dominating the space between them. "This woman saved my life when the rest of you sat safely behind these walls." Thorn paled slightly, bowing his head in quick submission. "Forgive me, my king," the lord muttered, retreating into the line of commanders. Raymond turned his attention back to Clara, his anger vanishing instantly. "Vance, escort Clara to the eastern chambers and ensure a fire is lit," he commanded. The general nodded respectfully, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. "My liege has council matters to attend to," Vance explained gently to her. Clara looked at Raymond, feeling a sudden surge of isolation in the vast courtyard. Noticing her hesitation, Raymond stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Rest today, Clara," he promised, his dark eyes softening. "No one in this fortress will ever cause you harm." She nodded, drawing courage from the absolute certainty in his words. Following General Vance, she entered the warmth of the massive stone keep. Tapestries depicting ancient battles lined the long, torchlit corridors. The eastern chambers were larger than her entire workshop back in Oakhaven. A massive four-poster bed stood in the center, covered in heavy velvet quilts. A roaring fire already burned in the stone hearth, chasing away the mountain chill. Vance bowed slightly before closing the heavy wooden door behind him. Clara stood alone in the center of the luxurious room, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her fate. Just yesterday, she had been starving on a freezing dirt floor. Now, she was the protected guest of the most dangerous man in the realm. She walked to the window, looking out over the snowy courtyard below. Raymond was still there, surrounded by his generals, pointing toward a map table. He looked up, his gaze finding her window with unerring accuracy. Even from a great distance, the fierce intensity of his stare made her breath catch in her throat. The beggar she had saved was gone, replaced entirely by a king preparing for war. Yet, as he gave a small, barely perceptible nod, she knew the man inside remained the same. Clara spent 2 restless days pacing the vast stone chamber. Servants brought her roasted meats and spiced wine. Maids offered to brush her hair and draw hot baths. Yet, the luxurious idleness gnawed at her spirit. She was a worker, shaped by years of labor. Sitting quietly in a velvet chair felt like a different kind of prison. On the 3rd morning, she slipped out of her room before dawn. The fortress of Blackreach buzzed with grim activity. Soldiers sharpened swords in the courtyard, their breath forming white clouds. Clara wandered down a narrow corridor until she smelled burning wool and oil. She pushed open a heavy iron door and found the quartermaster's workroom. Piles of torn uniforms and damaged leather armor covered long wooden tables. 3 elderly women sat near the hearth, struggling to mend the massive pile. Clara approached them quietly, offering a polite bow. Without waiting for permission, she picked up a heavy iron needle. She found a spool of thick linen thread and began to sew. Her fingers moved with swift precision through the tough fabric. By midday, she had repaired 2 dozen wool cloaks. The older women watched her in stunned silence. Word of the seamstress's skill spread rapidly through the lower barracks. Soldiers band out to the Boren's torn garments outside the workroom door. They did not know she was Raymond's protected guest. They only knew a skilled hand was preparing them for the coming winter campaign. One young soldier, barely old enough to hold a spear, brought her a torn, padded jacket. He explained nervously that it had belonged to his late father. Clara patched the damage meticulously, reinforcing the seams with extra wax thread. The boy wept when she returned it, pressing a wooden carved bird into her palm as thanks. Such simple moments anchored her soul in the foreign, imposing fortress. The following days fell into a quiet, steady rhythm. Clara became a fixture in the lower levels of Blackreach. She learned the names of the soldiers who guarded the eastern gates. She listened to their stories of families left behind in the southern provinces. Many had lost their homes to the usurper's harsh decrees. Their pain mirrored her own experiences in Oakhaven. This shared suffering forged a silent bond between the seamstress and the warriors. They began bringing her extra rations of sweet bread and dried fruit. She politely accepted their gifts, unaware of the fierce loyalty she was building. General Vance observed these interactions from the upper balconies. He reported everything back to Raymond during their nightly strategy meetings. "She mends more than their clothes, sire," Vance noted one evening. "She mends their morale." Raymond nodded, a rare sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knew true leadership could not be forced with a sword. It had to be earned through genuine care, something his brother completely lacked. Meanwhile, Raymond spent his days in the war room, planning his retribution. He orchestrated troop movements with ruthless calculation. Messengers arrived hourly with reports from spies in the southern capital. His brother was raising taxes again, bleeding the peasants dry to fund a mercenary army. Raymond ordered the immediate execution of any noble found supplying the false king. His commanders respected his absolute brutality in war. Yet, they noticed a strange shift in their sovereign's demeanor. He no longer remained in the war room until midnight. Instead, he often walked silently through the busy corridors to the lower levels. He paused outside the open door of the mending room. Clara sat close to the fire, her head bent over a torn tunic. She looked tired, but a peaceful focus settled over her features. Raymond leaned against the stone door frame, watching her hands move. He had spent his life destroying things with a blade. She spent hers piecing broken things back together. "You do not have to work here," Raymond said softly. Clara jumped slightly, turning to face him. She set the tunic down, offering a small, nervous smile. "Idleness makes me anxious," she admitted truthfully. "I need to earn my keep in this fortress." Raymond walked into the room, his heavy boots echoing on the stone. He pulled up a wooden stool and sat beside her. "You earned your keep the night you opened your door to a beggar," he replied. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing the calluses on her knuckles. His touch sent a sudden jolt of warmth up her arm. "My men speak of the mysterious woman mending their armor," Raymond continued. "They say her stitches are stronger than forged iron." Clara flushed, looking down at her lap. "It is simple work," she murmured. "It is vital work," he corrected, his voice deepening. Raymond stared into the fire, his expression growing dark and distant. "My brother severed the bonds of our family for a golden crown." Clara remained perfectly still, sensing the immense weight of his words. "He poisoned our father and blamed the murder on me," Raymond explained. "I barely escaped the capital with my life." He turned his gaze back to her, his eyes reflecting the orange flames. "Betrayal leaves a wound that no healer can close." Clara understood the profound loneliness hiding beneath his absolute power. She reached out, gently placing her hand over his. "Then you must build a new family from those who are loyal," she said. Raymond looked at her hand resting upon his scarred skin. He flipped his palm, intertwining his long fingers with hers. "I intend to," he stated, his voice dropping to a low whisper. The intensity in his eyes made Clara's heart race. He was a man who took whatever he desired, yet he held her hand with a strange, reverent caution. "When we march on the capital, I will leave a guard here to protect you," he promised. Clara squeezed his hand, a sudden surge of bravery filling her chest. "Come back from the war, Raymond," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his name since realizing his identity. The sound of it on her lips seemed to strike him physically. He leaned closer, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "I will return for you," he vowed, his breath warm against her cheek. "Neither winter nor steel will keep me away." Later that night, a harsh blizzard battered the stone walls of the fortress. Raymond found Clara asleep at the quartermaster's table. Her head rested on a folded cloak, a single candle burning low beside her. He gently slid his arms beneath her, lifting her from the hard wooden bench. Clara stirred, burying her face into his chest instinctively. He carried her back up the long, winding stairs to her chambers. He laid her on the velvet bed, pulling the heavy quilts over her shoulders. Raymond lingered by the door, watching her breathe in the warm silence of the room. He finally understood what he was truly fighting for. He was not just reclaiming a stolen throne. He was securing a world where someone as pure as Clara could safely exist. The fortress of Blackreach celebrated the end of the Winter War. Banners of the wolf replaced the crimson flags across the northern mountains. Clara sat in her quiet chamber, listening to the distant sounds of victory. She packed her few belongings into a small canvas sack. She belonged to the quiet streets of Oakhaven, not the grand halls of power. The war was over, and her purpose in this mountain stronghold was fulfilled. She slung the canvas sack over her shoulder and walked down the stone stairs. Clara walked out into the vast courtyard, squinting against the bright spring sun. The heavy iron gates stood open, allowing merchant wagons to enter the fortress. She approached the gate captain, a stern veteran she had mended a tunic for. "I wish to return to my village, Captain," Clara said evenly. The soldier frowned, stepping directly into her path. "My orders are to protect you within these walls, lady," he replied. Clara shook her head, adjusting the strap of her bag. I am a seamstress, not a prisoner of the crown, she insisted. Before the captain could argue, the sharp blast of a horn echoed from the valley. The courtyard fell instantly silent, every head turning toward the open gates. A small company of riders charged up the mountain path. At the front rode Raymond, driving his black warhorse to the absolute limit. Mud covered the beast's flanks, and the king's armor was dull with travel dust. Raymond pulled heavily on the reins, halting the horse in the center of the courtyard. He scanned the crowd, his dark eyes frantic and searching. His gaze locked onto Clara standing near the gates with her canvas sack. The gathered soldiers immediately dropped to their knees. Raymond ignored his commanders and walked straight toward her. The crowd parted effortlessly, terrified by the raw intensity radiating from him. He stopped a mere breath away, towering over her small frame. He was still wearing her mended wool cloak over his steel shoulder guards. "Where are you going?" he demanded, his voice rough from exhaustion. Clara looked up, meeting his fierce gaze without backing away. "The war is won, Raymond," she answered quietly. "Your place is in the capital, and mine is in Oakhaven." Raymond stared at her, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "My place is where I choose it to be," he stated flatly. Clara gestured toward the kneeling soldiers surrounding them. "You are the sovereign of the realm," she reminded him. "I am a peasant who sews clothes to buy winter bread." She swallowed hard, fighting the tears burning in her eyes. "There is a chasm between our worlds that no bridge can cross." Raymond did not yell, nor did he issue a royal command. He held it out, showing her the thick, waxed stitches holding the fabric together. He dropped the cloak onto the stone floor, the sound heavy in the silent courtyard. He tossed it carelessly to the ground beside the ruined garment. Then, he cupped her face with both of his large, calloused hands. "I conquered the capital, but I found nothing of value there," he told her. "The only treasure I possess is standing in this courtyard." Clara trembled, the heat of his palms warming her chilled skin. "They will call you a madman for choosing a commoner," she whispered. Raymond smiled, a rare expression that softened his scarred face completely. "Let them whisper while they kneel," he replied, his tone laced with absolute authority. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I survived the winter because of you, Clara." He stepped back slightly, keeping one hand firmly on her waist. Raymond turned to address the kneeling soldiers and gathered lords. His voice carried easily across the vast stone courtyard. "Hear my words and let them be known across the realm," the king commanded. "This woman is no guest and she is no captive." He pulled Clara tighter against his side. "She is the savior of the wolf, and my chosen equal." Clara buried her face against his armor, finally letting her tears fall. She was no longer afraid of the massive fortress or the harsh mountain winds. He looked down at her, the ruthless warlord completely subdued by devotion. The debt of a beggar had been paid with the heart of a king. He led her away from the gates, walking slowly back toward the inner keep. The heavy iron doors closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. Clara knew she would never return to the cramped workshop in Oakhaven. Her needle had mended a ruined cloak, but it had also bound her destiny to a sovereign. Inside the keep, the air felt warm and still. He moved with a heavy limp, a silent testament to his grueling ride from the capital. Clara noticed his fatigue and quickly pulled a wooden chair toward the hearth. "Sit down before you fall," she ordered, her tone surprisingly firm. He watched her move around the room, fetching a basin of warm water and clean linen. She knelt beside his chair, unbuckling the heavy steel greaves from his legs. "I am not helpless, Raymond," she replied, wiping the mud from his armor. He opened his eyes, studying the determined set of her jaw. Here, by the fire, she was the master of her domain once again. When the heavy steel finally fell away, she gasped softly. A dark purple bruise covered the entire left side of his ribs. Clara pushed him back by the shoulder, her touch light but insistent. "You fought an entire army and then rode back without resting," she scolded. Her cool fingers rubbed the ointment into his bruised skin. Raymond closed his eyes again, letting out a long, ragged sigh. The physical pain meant nothing compared to the relief of being near her. For months, he had lived on adrenaline, anger, and the cold desire for revenge. "I thought I would arrive too late," he admitted, his voice muffled. "I thought you would vanish into the snow like a ghost. And I am not going anywhere." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the velvet bed. Outside, the spring thaw continued to melt the bitter winter away. Inside, the most dangerous man in the north finally found his peace. Summer arrived in the northern mountains, bringing vibrant green moss to the dark granite peaks. Blackreach transformed from a military stronghold into the temporary heart of the kingdom. Raymond refused to return to the southern capital, forcing the nobility to travel north to swear their fealty. Caravans of silk pavilions and gilded carriages filled the muddy mountain passes. Southern lords complained bitterly about the harsh wind, wrapping themselves in velvet cloaks. They brought chests of gold, rare wines, and their unwed daughters. Whispers had reached the southern estates about the king's strange attachment to a peasant seamstress. The aristocrats assumed it was a passing fancy, a debt of honor that would fade with time. They believed a true sovereign required a queen of noble blood and high breeding. A grand banquet was organized in the great stone hall to receive the pledges of loyalty. Torches lined the massive walls, casting long shadows over the long oak tables. Clara sat beside Raymond on a raised dais, feeling the heavy weight of 1,000 judging eyes. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, entirely free of jewels or elaborate embroidery. Her dark hair was braided simply, contrasting sharply with the diamond-studded curls of the noble women. Raymond sat beside her in dark leather armor, looking more like a warrior than a reigning monarch. He rested his hand on the arm of her wooden chair, his presence a silent, terrifying warning to the room. One by one, the southern lords approached the dais, kneeling on the hard stone floor. They offered their oaths, their voices trembling slightly under Raymond's piercing gaze. Lord Harrington, a wealthy aristocrat who had secretly funded the usurper, stepped forward. He brought his daughter with him, a stunning woman wearing a gown of woven gold thread. Harrington bowed deeply, gesturing to the lavish chests of silver placed before the dais. "A tribute to your flawless victory, my king," the lord announced smoothly. Raymond did not look at the silver, his eyes fixed coldly on Harrington's face. "I accept the gold you stole from the peasantry during my absence," Raymond replied flatly. A nervous murmur rippled through the grand hall. Harrington swallowed hard, maintaining his polished smile with great effort. "The realm requires stability, sire," the lord continued, pushing his daughter forward slightly. "It requires strong alliances to heal the wounds of civil war." He cast a brief, dismissive glance toward Clara. "Lady Alara brings the loyalty of the southern ports and a bloodline worthy of the throne." The great hall fell entirely silent. The insult was veiled, but the meaning was unmistakably clear to everyone present. Clara felt her face burn, her fingers curling tightly into the fabric of her blue dress. She expected the nobility to reject her, but the public humiliation still stung. Raymond did not shout, nor did he reach for the broadsword resting at his hip. He simply stood up. The sheer physical presence of the man seemed to suck the air from the room. Harrington's confident smile instantly collapsed into genuine terror. Raymond walked down the throw-wooden steps of the dais, his boots echoing loudly. He stopped directly in front of the trembling aristocrat. "You speak of bloodlines and worth, Lord Harrington," Raymond said, his voice deadly quiet. "Where was your noble blood when my brother murdered our father?" Harrington opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You sat in your comfortable estates and counted the usurper's gold," Raymond continued. He turned slightly, extending his hand toward Clara. "When I was hunted like a dog in the freezing snow, this woman opened her door." Raymond's voice carried a dangerous, suppressed fury that made the nearest nobles step back. "She gave me her last fire, her last thread, and her absolute loyalty." He turned his dark eyes back to the terrified lord. "She possesses more nobility in her calloused hands than your entire ancestry." Harrington dropped to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold stone floor. "Forgive my insolence, my king," the man pleaded, his voice breaking. Raymond looked down at him with absolute disgust. "You will not apologize to me," the sovereign commanded. You will apologize to your queen." The word echoed through the silent hall, severing any remaining doubts about Clara's position. She was not a passing fancy or a temporary favorite. Raymond had just elevated a destitute seamstress above the highest lords of the realm. Harrington crawled forward, pressing his face to the wooden step near Clara's feet. "I beg your profound forgiveness, my lady," he wept. Clara looked at the broken aristocrat, then at the terrified noblewomen watching from the tables. She felt no desire for cruel vengeance, only a deep weariness of their political games. She stood up, her posture straight and calm. "You are forgiven, Lord Harrington," Clara said, her voice clear and remarkably steady. "But you will distribute your silver to the orphanages in the southern ports before winter arrives." A faint smile touched Raymond's lips as he watched her dispense justice. She did not rule with a sword, but her quiet authority was undeniable. Harrington nodded frantically, thanking her repeatedly as he scurried back to the crowd. Raymond walked back up the steps, offering his hand to Clara. He did not care about the shocked whispers of the high-born guests. He gently kissed the back of her hand, completely indifferent to the audience. "You make a terrifying queen," he murmured softly. Clara squeezed his hand, finally feeling the heavy tension leave her shoulders. "I learned from a very terrifying king," she replied quietly. The banquet resumed, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. No one dared to look at Clara with anything less than absolute respect. They realized that defying the seamstress meant facing the wrath of the wolf. Later that night, the great hall emptied, leaving only the dying fires in the hearths. Raymond and Clara walked together across the deserted courtyard. The summer stars shone brightly over the jagged mountain peaks. He wrapped his heavy arm around her waist, pulling her close against his side. "The South will test you again," Raymond warned, his tone serious. "Let them try," Clara answered, leaning her head against his shoulder. She had survived a freezing winter with nothing but a needle and her courage. She would survive the velvet courts of the nobility. As long as Raymond stood beside her, she feared absolutely nothing. 3 peaceful years passed, transforming the brutal northern landscape into a thriving sanctuary. Oakhaven was no longer a desperate, freezing village filled with starving peasants. Wide cobblestone streets replaced the muddy roads, lined with sturdy timber houses and bustling markets. Today, the king and queen returned to the village without the grand fanfare of a royal procession. They rode quietly alongside a small contingent of trusted guards, wearing simple woolen riding clothes. Clara guided her gentle gray mare through the familiar streets, a deep sense of nostalgia warring her chest. They stopped before a small, newly constructed stone building near the edge of the pine woods. A carved wooden sign hung above the heavy oak door reading, "The King's Hearth." It was the orphanage Clara had established with the silver confiscated from Lord Harrington. Raymond dismounted first, reaching up to help Clara down from her saddle. His scarred face remained stoic, but his dark eyes softened entirely when he looked at his wife. A frantic matron rushed forward to bow, but Clara stopped her with a gentle wave of her hand. "We are only here to visit the children, Martha," Clara said softly. Raymond stood near the doorway, letting Clara take the lead in this sanctuary. She possessed a quiet, radiant strength that commanded far more respect than his heavy sword ever could. While Clara spoke with the older girls, Raymond noticed a small movement in the far corner of the room. A young boy, perhaps 5 years old, sat entirely alone on a wooden bench. He clutched a torn, incredibly dirty piece of gray fabric to his thin chest. Raymond slowly walked across the room, his heavy boots making no sound on the floorboards. He crouched down in front of the bench, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. The child did not flinch, meeting the king's intense gaze with a stubborn, silent defiance. It was the same guarded look he had worn during his long, bitter exile in the mountains. "What is your name?" Raymond asked, his deep voice remarkably gentle. "Leo," he answered, his voice barely more than a rough whisper. "Why do you not play with the others, Leo?" the king inquired. Leo looked down at the torn gray cloth in his small hands. "I have to guard my blanket," the boy explained seriously. "It is all I have left to my name." The exact words struck Raymond like a physical blow to the chest. He remembered sitting by a dying fire offering a ruined cloak to a stranger with the exact same sentiment. Clara walked over, noticing the sudden heavy silence between her husband and the child. "Your blanket is very torn, Leo," Clara noted, offering a warm, understanding smile. The boy looked at her, sensing the genuine kindness radiating from her quiet voice. "A dog bit it when I was sleeping in the alley," Leo admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. Clara reached into the small leather pouch tied to her waist. "If you take it off, I will mend it for you," Clara offered softly. Leo hesitated, his dark eyes narrowing slightly in disbelief. "I have no coin to pay you," the boy warned, echoing the harsh lessons of the streets. He reached out, resting his large hand gently on the boy's thin shoulder. "The queen pays no heed to coin, Leo," Raymond assured him. Leo slowly held out the torn gray fabric, placing it carefully into Clara's waiting hands. Raymond remained crouched beside the boy, pointing out the neat, incredibly strong stitches she created. "She mended a cloak for me once, a long time ago," the king shared quietly. "It kept me warm through the longest winter of my life." Leo looked up at the towering, heavily scarred warrior, his fearful defiance melting away. For the first time, a small, tentative smile touched the orphan's pale face. When Clara finished, she handed the repaired blanket back to the boy. Clara looked at Raymond, a silent, profound conversation passing between them in a single glance. Raymond stood up, offering his large hand to the young boy. "How would you like to guard your blanket in a castle, Leo?" the king asked. The child's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, looking between the fearsome monarch and the gentle queen. "I can come with you?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling with sudden hope. Clara placed her hand on the boy's back, guiding him forward. "You will never sleep in an alley again," she promised fiercely. Later that afternoon, the royal party rode out of Oakhaven toward the high mountain passes. Leo sat safely in front of Raymond on the massive black warhorse. The boy leaned back against the king's solid chest, wrapped completely in his mended gray blanket. Clara rode closely beside them, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over her serene face. He had spent his early life destroying his enemies and conquering vast territories. He had believed that absolute power and violent retribution were the only ways to survive. It had come from a humble seamstress who chose mercy in the middle of a freezing storm. They passed the old, ruined foundation of Clara's former workshop. Wildflowers now grew through the broken floorboards, reclaiming the site of their first meeting. The wolf had finally found his pack, and his kingdom would never be cold again. This story really reminds me that a single, quiet act of kindness can be stronger than any army. If Clara and Raymond's journey touched your heart today, please subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious about who is listening. Where in the world are you joining me from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And while you're there, tell me, what kind of story should we do next? A dangerous outlaw finding redemption? Or maybe a forbidden romance? Leave your ideas below, and I'll see you in the next one.